This was easy to miss, but did you know that Ukraine was still transporting Russian gas through its pipelines as of this week? Well, it is not anymore, and the whole bizarre reason why it was happening for so long is worth a closer look. Oh, and the fact that this somehow puts Russia's hold of Transnistria in question just makes it all the stranger. But we should begin with the basics of the main pipeline. It runs from Suja in Russia, through the northern tier of Ukraine, and into Slovakia. If Suja sounds familiar, that is because it is the main settlement that Ukraine captured during the Kursk offensive. There was a lot of, silly chatter within online analysis that the whole operation was about Russian gas revenues. Maybe Ukraine had chosen Suja as its target, so it could hit the pumping facility there, and thereby deny Russian revenues from its gas trade. That, of course, completely ignored how the silly pipeline runs through Ukraine, and Kyiv could have stopped the gas flows at any time if it had wanted to. Rather, Ukraine continued to act as a conduit for two reasons: money and European politics. The latter is the easier point, so let's begin with it. Most of Europe weaned itself off of Russian gas starting at the beginning of the war, shifting over to liquefied natural gas supplies from the United States, Qatar, and others. You know that Trump would be overjoyed to hear that one consequence of this war is Europe becoming more dependent on American fuel, even if some of them have been waiting until the last minute to do so. Just something to keep in mind as the chatter about negotiations increases. However, Slovakia, Austria, and Hungary still stuck to the pipeline imports. Let's focus on Hungary because it was the biggest problem of the bunch. Its leader, Viktor Orban, is friendly with Putin, and Hungary acted as a veto point in all sorts of European Union and NATO policy proposals. The joys of unanimous rule. Anyway, the ability to cut the gas flows gave Kyiv some leverage in those negotiations. The other half of it was cash. Ukraine was not letting Russian gas pass through blue and yellow territory out of the goodness of its heart. No, Russia was paying for the privilege to do so, something on the order of $1 billion per year. But wait, you might protest, they are at war. How could they possibly be trading with one another? And to answer that, we obviously need some lines on maps. Remember, war is just an alternative mechanism to arrive at a political outcome. Thank you, Karl von Clausewitz, for that. If this is what war would hypothetically produce as its expected outcome, and each side would internalize the costs of fighting as the space between that outcome and their associated colored lines, then the space up to the colored lines represents the war values for each side. Would you rather have that and a bunch of money created from trade, or just that and even more poverty? It turns out, and I hope that you are sitting down for this, countries like more money to less money, and so they tend to prefer the former option. As a result, trade in war between antagonists is not uncommon. For example, during the American Civil War, the South traded cotton to the North in exchange for food and clothing. Even in the midst of the Armada siege of the British Isles, England was still selling food to Spain. More geographically relevant to us, Britain promoted the idea of free seas and free goods during the Crimean War. But wait, you might protest again. You could use that money to build more armaments, and then screw over your opponent in the war. And yeah, you could. Everybody say thanks to the lines on maps for illustrating that. However, two counterpoints. One, the other side is perfectly capable of doing the same thing. And two, if one side has a better conversion rate of cash to weapons, for example, hypothetically Russia in this instance, you can just distort the trade surplus further in the other side's favor to negate that. Thus, war might affect the terms of trade, but it does not inherently doom it. Trades between in-division rivals in sports provide a rough analogy here. It is harder to reach a deal with an opponent whom you are in direct competition with for a playoff spot than a team in a separate league. But it does happen. The teams just have to be extra cautious that the trade is relatively balanced. As a result, there are only two real barriers to trade between warring parties. To begin, the bargaining friction that is causing the war to happen in the first place might also cause negotiations over trade to fail. For example, if the war is occurring because there is disagreement over how one side internalizes the costs of fighting, well, that also extends to how it internalizes the benefits of trade. Thus, you get both war and the death of the trade relationship. Second, you also need to have people physically willing to execute the trade. For instance, right now, you would have a hard time convincing Ukrainian shippers to try to float goods from Odessa to Rostov. All of that added insurance premiums and hazard pay make trade between the two unprofitable for economic reasons, not military reasons. In contrast, a pipeline is just a pipeline. The construction process occurred long ago. Now the gas just goes through it. You only need people to monitor the meter. No one will get exposed to physical danger, so that is not an issue. As for the bargaining friction part, well, there are a whole bunch of possibilities there. But apparently they were no issue as of December 31st, 2024. As for Ukraine's strategy here, it is straightforward given the circumstances. To be blunt, Russia's economy is in bad shape. Plunging exchange rates, consumer goods shortages, troublesome inflation, and sky-high interest rates to combat that. And perhaps more pertinent to our current story, also what appears to be the dwindling end of Russia's reserve materiel supplies. Heading into 2025, rather than restoring Soviet-era weaponry, Russia is going to have to rely on building many more of its weapons systems from scratch. That means yet higher supply costs, and an even greater demand for labor, and all of the economic headaches that come along with those. In other words, now is the time that Russia could use an influx of cash to smooth over its corresponding problems. Instead, Ukraine is making a power play by taking away some of the money from Russia's reserves. At the start of the war, Europe piped in about 140 billion cubic meters of Russian gas per year. By 2024, it had fallen to 30 billion. With the latest closures, 2025 is set to drop to 15 billion. Indeed, the only Russian pipeline that still provides gas to Europe is the Turk Stream. Now, that strategy does not come without risks. Ukraine's economy is in a worse position than Russia's. The difference is that this is not a war of economic luxury for Kyiv. So the gamble is that losing that $1 billion per year does not make much of a political difference inside of Ukraine. But the economic losses may have greater sting within Moscow. Meanwhile, the lost Russian gas will upset the three countries still importing it, at a time when Slovakia's prime minister visited Moscow a few days before Christmas. But we will have to wait for the next big debate inside the halls of the European Union and NATO to see what the consequences are there. And, as if to maximize world confusion, all of this is happening at the same time as a separate gas dispute involving Moldova and Transnistria. Here is the short version. Gazprom claims that Moldova owes $709 million to Russia. Moldova claims the amount is only $8.6 million, backed by British and Norwegian audits, and rejected Gazprom's demands. As a result, Russia announced that it would be terminating shipments to Moldova effective January 1st. Quite a coincidence that January 1st was the same day that Ukraine halted transit access. However, one slight detail: Transnistria. Transnistria is this long sliver of land on the east of Moldova. It has been de facto independent from the fall of the Soviet Union, having fought a civil war similar to what went on in Georgia's South Ossetia and Abkhazia regions. It even has a detachment of Russian troops garrisoned there year-round, and you may remember hearing about it at the start of Russia's invasion, as the Kremlin had hopes of linking up with Transnistria. Well, that part of the invasion failed, and now Transnistria is in hot water. Or at least it would be if there was any gas there to heat the place. Using our incredible powers of observation, the only ways to pipe gas into Transnistria are via Ukraine and Moldova. We can take Ukraine off the board. And if Russia tried piping gas through Moldova, Moldova could step in and make a hostile purchase. Now, despite having been cut off from Russia's supply, the situation is not actually that bad for Moldova. It is simply substituting its purchases via Romanian holdings. Further, even with continued hostilities from the period of the Civil War, Moldova is offering to transit that gas into Transnistria. All Transnistria has to do is pay Moldova the market price. One slight problem: Transnistria cannot afford that. The region is dirt poor. In fact, the gas it was receiving from Russia came free of charge, one of the many perks of being a part of the Russian bloc. Price aside, this could not have come at a worse time. It is winter in the Northern Hemisphere, and Transnistria does not have a friendly climate. Health ministers are providing information on how not to die of hypothermia, which is a really bad sign if that is happening at the start of a crisis. It is even causing a run on firewood. Now, before anyone in the West has visions of an uprising in Transnistria, Russia is genuinely popular in the region. This is not a situation like in, say, Belarus, where there is a serious base of resistance should tensions rise, following a claimed Lukashenko victory coming up on January 26th. Keep an eye out for that. But it does create an extra bit of vulnerability for Russian troops in the area, who have effectively lived under siege for the last 3 years. Of course, Ukraine has not done anything there as of yet. Part of this is because Moldova would not be thrilled by the added instability in what is internationally recognized as its own territory. Another part is this complicated relationship where Transnistria takes the free gas from Russia, runs it through this power station on the border with Ukraine, and then sells the electricity back to Moldova, giving Moldova cheap power and Transnistria some hard currency. Ukraine's reticence is also partially because Ukraine does not want to motivate Transnistrians to pick up arms and fight back. To wit, throughout the invasion, they have been perfectly happy to tell everyone that this is not their fight and sit at home instead. Remember, Russia is facing enough of a manpower shortage to turn to North Korea for help. You could only imagine how happy the Kremlin would be if a pool of 100,000 Transnistrians suddenly became interested in signing up. But it sure would create a media stir if Ukraine started lobbing missiles specifically targeted at Russian soldiers there. Remember, part of the point of the Kursk offensive was to bring the war home to a new set of people. There are worse targets than the Russian soldiers living on a frozen island. Meanwhile, if you were stranded on a frozen island and could only bring one book with you, I have a couple of great options to recommend. Hey, at the very least, you could use them as kindling to start a fire. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.